Right now, somewhere in the world, someone is putting tomato sauce on their pasta. Someone else is slicing a tomato for their sandwich. Someone is making salsa. Someone is cooking curry. Someone is eating pizza. It is almost impossible to imagine cooking without tomatoes. And yet, for most of European history, people genuinely believed that tomatoes would kill you. Not just afraid of the taste, not just suspicious of the smell. They genuinely believed that eating a tomato would cause death. Doctors warned against it. Priests warned against it. Noblemen avoided it completely. The tomato, that is now at the center of almost every cuisine on earth, was once considered one of the most dangerous foods in the world. This is the story of the tomato, a fruit that spent thousands of years feeding people in the Americas, was taken to Europe, where it was feared and rejected for nearly 3 centuries. Then slowly, gradually, became the most important ingredient in European and world cooking, and transformed how the entire planet eats. The story begins in the wild highlands of the Andes Mountains, in South America, in the region we now call Peru and Ecuador. Wild tomato plants grew scattered across these highlands thousands of years ago. They were small, much smaller than what we eat today, about the size of a large pea, and they were yellow, not red. These tiny wild tomatoes were spread northward by birds and animals. They arrived in Mexico, where a civilization called the Aztecs were building one of the greatest empires in the Americas. The Aztecs were extraordinary agricultural scientists. Over many generations, they carefully selected the largest and tastiest tomatoes and replanted them. The Aztecs called it tomatl, which simply meant the swelling fruit. They ate it in many ways: raw, cooked, in sauces, combined with chili peppers, squash, and other ingredients to make complex and flavorful dishes. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in Mexico in 1519, they found the tomato at the center of Aztec cuisine. The first written record of the tomato in Europe comes from an Italian botanist named Pietro Andrea Mattioli in 1544. He described a new plant he called pomodoro, the golden apple. Notice, he called it golden, not red, because the first tomatoes to arrive in Europe were yellow varieties. But here is where the story takes a strange turn. The tomato belongs to the plant family called Solanaceae, the nightshade family, and several members of this family are genuinely deadly. Deadly nightshade, henbane, mandrake, all of them poisonous, all of them in the same family as the tomato. European botanists noticed immediately the similarity between tomatoes and these deadly plants. The leaves of the tomato plant do actually smell unpleasant when crushed. The stems contain small amounts of toxic compounds, and the plates that wealthy Europeans ate from were made of pewter, a metal containing lead. When acidic tomatoes were eaten from pewter plates, they leached the lead out, causing actual poisoning. So the wealthy Europeans, who ate from pewter plates, really did get sick after eating tomatoes. The tomato was not guilty. The lead in the pewter was guilty. But nobody knew that. The tomato got the blame, and for nearly 3 centuries, wealthy Europeans avoided the tomato completely. The poor, who ate from wooden plates, had no such problem. While Northern Europe feared the tomato, something different was happening in Spain and Italy. The Spanish, who had conquered the Aztecs, had watched the Aztecs eat tomatoes for years, and the Spanish had not died. Cautiously, Spanish and Italian cooks began experimenting. By the late 1500s, tomatoes were beginning to appear in Italian and Spanish cooking. The first recorded tomato recipe in Europe appears in a Spanish cookbook from around 1600. It describes a sauce made with tomatoes, chili peppers, and other ingredients. That sounds remarkably similar to modern salsa. In Italy, by the early 1600s, tomatoes were being sold in markets, though still used mostly as decoration or medicine. Northern Europe remained much more resistant. In Britain, the tomato was called the love apple, which sounds romantic, but was actually suspicious. It was associated with aphrodisiacs and immoral behavior. The Puritans of England, and later New England, were deeply suspicious of anything associated with pleasure or passion. The tomato was both. In Germany, the tomato was called Wolfpeach, Wolfspfirsch. People believed it attracted werewolves. Literally, that planting a tomato near your house would bring werewolves to your door. In France, doctors warned that the tomato inflamed the passions and caused brain fever. The fear of the tomato across Northern Europe was genuinely remarkable. While Europe feared the tomato, something important was happening. Back in the Americas, the tomato had never disappeared from American cooking. In Mexico, in Central America, in what would become the American Southwest, indigenous peoples had been cooking with tomatoes for centuries, completely unaware that Europeans thought their everyday ingredient was deadly poison. The turning point for the tomato in America came in the late 1700s. Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers and a passionate gardener, was fascinated by tomatoes. He grew them at Monticello, his Virginia plantation. He ate them publicly. He served them to guests. He kept detailed records of his tomato plants. Jefferson was essentially running a one-man pro-tomato campaign. According to legend, on September 26, 1820, a man named Robert Gibbon Johnson stood on the steps of the Salem, New Jersey courthouse, in front of a crowd, waiting to watch him die. He ate an entire basket of tomatoes. The crowd gasped. They waited. He did not die. He did not even get sick. The crowd was astonished. The story of Robert Gibbon Johnson may be partly legend. Historians debate the details, but whether completely true or not, it reflects something real about the period. By the 1820s, some Americans were beginning to eat tomatoes openly, and the feared killer fruit was slowly becoming something else, something ordinary, something delicious. In Italy, the transformation was even more dramatic. Italian cooks had been experimenting with tomatoes for over a century. By the 1700s, the combination of tomatoes with pasta was beginning to emerge. The first documented recipe for pasta with tomato sauce appears in a Neapolitan cookbook called Lo Scalco alla Moderna in 1692. Naples became the world's first great tomato city. The Neapolitan poor, called lazzaroni, ate tomatoes constantly, on pasta, on bread, raw with salt, cooked with olive oil and garlic. The tomato was cheap, it was filling, it was delicious. And in the warm southern Italian climate, it grew abundantly and easily. Then in 1889, something happened that would cement the tomato's place in world history forever. Queen Margherita of Italy was visiting Naples. A local pizza maker named Raffaele Esposito was asked to prepare pizzas for the Queen. He made 3 different pizzas. The Queen's favorite had tomato sauce, mozzarella, and basil. Esposito named the pizza Margherita after the Queen. The pizza Margherita, with its red, white, and green, matching the Italian national flag, became the most famous pizza in the world. And the tomato was at its center. The fruit that was once too dangerous to eat was now the defining ingredient of a national dish that would conquer the world. Meanwhile, in America, the tomato was finding a completely new form. In 1812, an American scientist named Alexander Livingston. No, wait. The real story is simpler. American cooks had discovered that tomatoes could be preserved by cooking them down into a thick sauce. This thick cooked tomato sauce would eventually become ketchup. The word ketchup actually comes from a Chinese word, ketchup, which was a fermented fish sauce from Southeast Asia. British sailors brought this Asian sauce home. American cooks eventually adapted the concept using tomatoes. In 1876, Henry John Heinz began selling bottled tomato ketchup commercially, and the world was never the same. Heinz ketchup was an extraordinary success. By 1905, Heinz was selling 5 million bottles per year. The tomato that European nobility had feared for 3 centuries was now in a bottle on every American dining table, and it was being eaten by everyone, rich and poor alike. The most democratic food in the most democratic nation. But the tomato story was happening on another front too. In 1897, the Campbell Soup Company began selling condensed tomato soup in its distinctive red and white cans. A young artist named Andy Warhol would one day make these cans among the most famous images in American art history. But in 1897, Campbell's tomato soup was simply the most convenient and affordable meal in America. In the 20th century, the tomato transformed global food in ways that nobody could have predicted. Italian immigrants arriving in America in the late 1800s and early 1900s brought their tomato cooking traditions. They opened restaurants. They sold tomato products. They cooked for their neighbors. And America fell completely in love with Italian tomato cooking. Pizza, which had been a Neapolitan street food, became an American obsession. The first American pizzeria, Lombardi's, opened in New York City in 1905. By the 1950s, after World War II soldiers had tasted pizza in Italy and come home wanting more, pizza was spreading across America. By 1958, Pizza Hut had opened its first restaurant. Today, the tomato is the most consumed fruit in the world by weight. Yes, technically, the tomato is a fruit, a vegetable in culinary terms, a fruit in botanical terms. The United States Supreme Court actually ruled on this question. In 1893, in the case of Nix versus Hedden, the court decided the tomato was legally a vegetable for the purposes of import tariffs. The world now produces about 186 million tons of tomatoes every year. China is the largest producer. India is second. The United States is third. Italy, the country that made tomatoes famous, is fourth. Tomatoes are eaten in virtually every culture on earth. Raw, cooked, dried, canned, as sauce, as juice, as paste, as ketchup, as salsa. Science has confirmed what many people already know intuitively. Tomatoes are extraordinarily nutritious. They contain vitamin C, vitamin K, potassium, folate, and most importantly, a compound called lycopene, which gives tomatoes their red color and has been shown to reduce the risk of certain cancers and heart disease. The fruit that was once called poison is now considered among the healthiest foods on earth. The tomato also changed how we think about climate and agriculture. The tomato's success in Italian and Spanish cooking happened because the Mediterranean climate was perfect for growing it. Hot, dry summers, rich soil, long growing seasons. The tomato arrived in a landscape that seemed designed for it, and it transformed that landscape forever. There is also a more recent chapter in the tomato's story, the invention of the industrial tomato. In the 1940s and 1950s, plant breeders developed new varieties of tomato designed not for flavor, but for industrial production. These tomatoes were tough, so they could survive mechanical harvesting. They were uniform, so they looked good in supermarkets, but they tasted like almost nothing. The bland industrial tomato created a reaction, a growing movement of farmers and consumers demanding heirloom tomatoes, old varieties with extraordinary flavor. Purple tomatoes, yellow tomatoes, striped tomatoes, green tomatoes, tiny cherry tomatoes, giant beefsteak tomatoes. The tomato, in all its original diversity, was coming back. The tomato has also become politically controversial. In the modern world, the North American Free Trade Agreement created conflict between American and Mexican tomato farmers. Florida tomato farmers accused Mexico of dumping cheap tomatoes on the American market, destroying their industry. The humble tomato at the center of international trade disputes, tariffs, treaties, politics. The fruit that once started fear campaigns now starts trade wars. There is one more chapter in the tomatoes story that most people do not know. In Spain, there is an annual festival called La Tomatina, held every year in the town of Buñol on the last Wednesday of August. Thousands of people come from around the world to throw tomatoes at each other. For 1 hour, the streets of Buñol run red with tomato juice. La Tomatina began in 1945 by accident. During a festival parade, a group of young men were fighting to take part in a parade float. They knocked over a vegetable stall and started throwing whatever was nearby, which happened to be tomatoes. The next year, they did it on purpose, and a tradition was born. From the wild highlands of the ancient Andes, where tiny yellow berries grew unnoticed among the rocks, to the markets of the Aztecs, where tomato was a daily ingredient, to the fearful botanists of Europe who saw the family resemblance, to deadly nightshade and warned the world, to the pewter plates of wealthy nobles who blamed the tomato for their lead poisoning, to Thomas Jefferson eating tomatoes publicly to convert a skeptical nation, to Queen Margherita choosing the red and white pizza that would make Italy and the tomato inseparable forever, to Henry John Heinz bottling the fruit that had been called poison and selling 5 million bottles a year, to the streets of Buñol running red with tomato juice in joyful celebration. The tomato won. The next time you eat a slice of pizza or a bowl of pasta, or dip something in ketchup, or add tomatoes to a salad, remember, you are eating something that was once considered deadly poison by some of the most educated people in the world, and that the fear was wrong, and the tomato was right, all along. Thank you for watching this story on Storia English. If you enjoyed learning English through this story, please subscribe to Storia English. Every week we bring you a new story from history, told in clear, slow, simple English, so you can improve your listening, vocabulary, and confidence, naturally, without stress. We will see you in the next story.